Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. And it's wonderful to be here to share some of the work I've been doing over the last couple of years. And so we're going to have a little bit more of a focus on lawns. But before we get there, I want to frame this talk within this idea of habitat loss. And so we just heard about the importance of forests and their opportunity for providing habitat for wildlife. And so when I think about these forests, especially in terms of fragmentation, this picture comes to mind where you have these dichotomized landscapes, the one on the left as more of a pristine forested habitat, whereas the one on the right really looking at this non-habitat. And we know from decades of research that urban development is one of the greatest threats to biodiversity on a global scale. But the thing to remember is that after the bulldozers leave, after that initial development phase, these non-habitats really translate into these novel habitats. And so I like to think of it as habitat loss and alteration. And so my research is really interested in looking at that alteration component and how management interplays with that. And so as Sarah mentioned, I focus a lot of my work in private lands, mostly in urban and suburban yards. And when we think about the amount of real estate they take up, it's a significant component. And when I look at the green space, here I have really highlighted the lawns, I look at that as potential habitat. And so that's really where I try to focus my work and really trying to look at this hopefulness of urban development. And so lawns. Let's talk a little bit about lawns. So in the United States, they cover 163,800 square kilometers. To put that number into perspective, that's roughly the size of the state of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. It's a lot of area. It's the most irrigated crop in the United States, and it takes up, as I have listed here on the slide, about 60% of a residential parcel. Because of the monoculture of these lawns, there's very little structural diversity, there's very little plant diversity in here. Some of my colleagues have vilified these lawns, and I like this quote from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, their yard map program, where they're calling these biodiversity deserts, and that they're relatively useless for birds and bees. And so I must admit, I used to fly this flag as well. Used to think that lawns were just useless and really just had no value for habitat. But I kept coming back to this number of 163,800 square kilometers. And it's an impossible feat for us to try to get rid of or significantly reduce the amount of lawns. And so I started to change my tune a little bit and came up with this new mantra: how do we make lawns less bad? And really trying to understand some of the management decisions that we make, and can we change those to provide wildlife habitat in these spaces. And so over the past 10 years, I've really delved really deep into lawn management. And one of the ways that we can look at these different management decisions is along these temporal scales. And so we know that people are daily irrigating, they're weekly mowing, or on a seasonal basis might be applying pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer. And we know from research that across the United States that not everybody is irrigating or fertilizing. However, roughly 98% of Americans who have lawns are mowing. And so to me, that really provides this opportunity to find out ways that we can change these behaviors to see whether or not they might be beneficial for bees. And so why do I link lawns and bees? And so let's put lawns into a social construct first, a social context. So why do we mow our lawns? It's mostly for these aesthetics. We want our lawns to look nice, mostly for our neighbors, but also for ourselves. And as this picture on the top from the 1950s Better Homes and Gardens magazine really demonstrates, that our lawns are really seen as the extension of our home. But as an ecologist, I look at these lawns as potential habitat, and that every time we mow, could we be potentially removing floral resources that could be important for bees? And I started thinking about this about 10 years ago when my news feed was just riddled with information about the decline of bees, and we're really trying to figure out some solutions to try to improve their habitat and try to increase their numbers. And so with that in mind, I designed a research question that really got at these two key components. First of all, with a natural historian at heart, I was really interested about the habitat value of these lawn-dominated yards. And second, were there specific management decisions that we could make that could change? And so I designed a study that tested the hypothesis that if we mow our lawns less frequently, do we have more lawn flowers? These would be these spontaneous plants. Some people might call them weeds, like dandelions and clover. And so if we have more weeds, or sorry, I don't want to call them weeds, if we have more flowers, will we in turn have more bees? And so what we found doing the study in Springfield, Massachusetts, was that there were a lot of different flowers that were growing spontaneous in 16 different yards in the city of Springfield. And so I have listed here the top 10 most common and abundant and widespread species, and then on the right-hand side, some of the ones that I just found really just lovely to look at. But in terms of the hypothesis, like if you mow your lawns less frequently, do you have more lawn flowers? The short answer is yes. And so the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, and so we designed the study, I should go back a second here, to the different yards that we worked in were divided into 3 different mowing categories. So they were mowed every week or every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. Prior to mowing, we went in to count and identify all the different flowers and bees that were present in these spaces. And so we found that mowing less frequently, you have a significant more numbers of flowers. I think it's about 3 times as many. In terms of the natural history of these lawns, this is also a pretty extraordinary number in terms of bee diversity. We identified 111 different species of bees. Now, to put that into perspective, in the state of Massachusetts, this represented roughly a quarter of all bees recorded in the state. Some of these yards had, more than 35 species in them, and on the bottom left corner, I have a picture of one of the typical yards that we used for the study. And so I want you to note that there's nothing special about them. They did not have special plantings or pollinator gardens. These were, as I'm calling them, these lawn-dominated yards. And this one was an example of a yard that was mowed every 2 weeks, and hopefully you can make out some of the clover that's growing. On the right-hand picture, I have an image of the Lasioglossum ilioense. I know it's not very exciting to look at. It's roughly the size of a grain of rice. But what was really interesting about this species was that it was our most abundant bee that we collected over the course of 2 years. Now, the last time Lasioglossum ilioense was recorded in the state of Massachusetts was in the 1920s, and the records were from the eastern part of the state. So we got pretty excited about this. We did some genetic analysis. It wasn't anything special. It was just we're able to document the species moving north. But I think it also really demonstrates that when you start investigating some of these dismissed places, you never know what you're going to find, and there's all these great opportunities for discovery. In terms of some of the traits of the bees that we were discovering in these lawn-dominated yards in Springfield, most of them were native to North America. The majority of them were from the family Halictidae, and they are mostly nesting in the ground, and they are mostly generalist species, so these polylectic bees. So these results weren't too surprising, but pie charts are cool. But let's just take a moment just to enjoy some of the actual bees that we did identify and we documented in our yards, and just to really enjoy some of the diversity of bees. Like I still can't get over the metallic green of the sweat bees on the top left corner, and the bumblebees, they're just so incredibly cute and fuzzy. But again, just to really celebrate the diversity of these bees that are buzzing around just below our feet. In terms of the hypothesis of whether or not we mow less frequently, do we have more bees, the graph on the right-hand side demonstrates that yes, that is true. So this is also really exciting results that we had, and we were able to demonstrate through our modeling approach that the bee abundance was related to the amounts of floral resources. And although it didn't exactly follow the patterns that we expected, we thought that the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks were going to have the highest bee abundance. One of the things that we think might be going on here is that in addition to the yards that are mowed every 3 weeks, so even though they had more flowers, they also had taller grass. And so for a lot of these bees, as I mentioned before, they're about the size of a grain of rice. And so what we're thinking that might be going on in these 3-week yards is that even though they have more flowers, the grasses are a little bit too tall, making it not as optimal conditions for these bees to go in and access the floral resources that they need. But still want to conduct some more research to really find out what's going on here. Now, I just want to take a little detour and talk about some of these ecosystem disservices. And so Vince talked a lot about ticks. And so this is, something that's on everybody's mind, especially here in the Northeast. And so when I started the study and I was telling colleagues and friends about it and describing the whole study system, the number one thing people asked me was, well, what about the ticks? If you don't mow your lawn frequently, you're going to have tall grass and you're going to have ticks. And as Vince mentioned, this is a significant problem, especially in Massachusetts. As I have listed here, that there's 30,000 cases over the course of 10 years of Lyme disease in Massachusetts. And so this was a really big concern that I wanted to address in the research. And so while designing the study, in addition to looking at the number of lawn flowers and bees, also looked at the number of ticks. And so went in and did tick drags to really see whether or not there was a relationship with lawn mowing frequency. And so I want everybody just to take a 5-second pause and just, in your head or write down on a scrap piece of paper, how many ticks do you think we found in these yards? And so surprisingly, we found 0 over the course of 2 years. And so again, I just want to reiterate that ticks are present in these landscapes. And so I shelved these data for a while. And then in 2018, Consumer Reports came out with an article about how to tick-proof your yard by keeping your grass short. And when I looked at the recommendation, I realized that that aligned with the 1-week mowing regime. And so I called up Vince to discuss this because he has so much expertise on tick ecology. And we decided that it would be really important to publish these results after all because context really matters. So as Vince mentioned about the importance of leaf litter, and we're not going to be finding that much leaf litter in the middle of these lawns. And so I have here 2 aerial views of 2 different properties, one on the left surrounded by forest, most likely a lot of leaf litter, most likely more opportunities to interact with ticks. Whereas the yards where we conducted the research and where most of the suburban landscapes are located are not going to have those same interactions with these ticks. So it's really important to acknowledge these limitations and really understanding some of the trade-offs when you're trying to reduce risk, but also trying to provide benefits. Okay, so let's go back to this question. Are these lawns biological deserts? So I think not. And however, if it were up to me, I would love for all of our yards to look something like this. But I also acknowledge that for some people, this might not be attractive. It might not be something that people really want, or people might not really know how to grow a pollinator garden in their yards. And so in addition to having these pollinator gardens, what our research is demonstrating is that you also can do less. You can mow your lawn less frequently and also provide bee habitat. And so we call this the lazy lawnmower approach, and we acknowledge that it's economical, it's time-saving, and it's simple. So again, rather than having to do something, you can do less. And to finish up here, I just want to expand this, the applications of this work. And so although it was conducted in these suburban landscapes, it's really trying to take on this all lands approach, and that anywhere where we're managing these lawns can have implications for bee habitat. And this can be particularly the case, especially when we're close to these agricultural areas and then also for these other types of grasslands that we are actively managing. And here we have these verges, golf courses, public land, and public rights of ways, which we will hear about next from Randy. And so in sum, just want to give a shout out to Obi-Wan Kenobi, who foresaw some of the results of my research. And I just want to make some brief acknowledgments and thanks to all the people that helped with the research. And for those of you who would like to mow your lawn less and let your neighbors know what you're doing, we have free lawn signs to let your neighbors know that that's what you're doing. And I will be happily turn it over to Randy. Thanks so much.